everybody. Beau Billington with the Free Agent Podcast. Yet again, I've got Jake Stahl here. Jake, round two. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me on for the sequel. Very excited to do this.
Yeah. So last time, we got deep in all things, related to like ICP development, refining and defining somebody's, elevator pitch, but then also like creating referral circles. So it's all around kind of like, sales and like forward facing type of proposition. And today we're gonna jump into a little bit of a different direction and get more tactical and talk about things, in regards to like pricing out, an opportunity. Is that done monthly, weekly? How many clients should one take? What's the ideal split? How long should it take for somebody to be successful, et cetera? So really excited to have you on today. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh, well, again, Beau, my pleasure. It's always great talking with you.
Yeah. And so prior to jumping in, maybe you can give kind of the 30-second elevator pitch for those that are looking. Obviously you're deep in the learning game. So chief learning officer, but also a sales coach and a fractional exec at that. So give us a little bit of background on kind of who you are, what your ICP is, and the value that your clients, experience.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in training and development for 30 years. I've been a fractional for 10. My skill set is basically I have a degree in psychology. I have trained in 6 countries, 47 states, and I have certifications in neurolinguistic programming. So not only do I help people form and develop training departments or create onboarding programs, but I'm also available for individual coaching, for fractional getting started, for a CEO that's got roadblocks, or that salesperson who just absolutely wants to skyrocket their sales.
That's excellent. What's funny too is this is the second time that I've gotten to hear your elevator pitch, and you did not deviate much from the initial, and it was very succinct with no ums or buts. So it sounds like it's been practiced a lot. But
thank you.
Let's get into things here. So I think in terms of folks that are considering going fractional, pricing is a really can be a touchy subject for a lot of folks. And not only what is your price? Is it hourly? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it project based? How do you get to price? And I'd love to hear your perspective, and I'll share my perspective as well. But any tips, tricks, tidbits for those that are maybe jumping into the fractional space or already in the fractional space, but struggling, putting a wrapper around their offering?
Yeah, I think possibly one of the first rules of thumb, Beau, is when you're creating your pricing, and we could talk a little bit about how we get to a pricing model. But when you're doing your pricing, don't negotiate. I think one of the biggest thing we do when we get into the fractional world and we're trying to get that first client is we say, okay, it's going to be $10,000 a month. And they're like, well, I wasn't looking to spend that much. So then they drop and they go, well, I could probably do it for $8,000 a month. Right. And before you know it, you've devalued yourself so dramatically that it's literally detrimental. So the money you're gaining is not worth the hit it's taking to your name. The other thing to consider with that is that if that client is happy with you, they're going to take that low price tag you gave them and they're going to give that to somebody else. So what winds up happening is a negotiated low price to try to get a first client now goes viral to other clients. And you find yourself in a trap of having to tell people, well, I actually charge more for that. So I guess I just wanted to preface it with that and get your thoughts on that.
I think that's some sage advice, and it's actually a trap that I myself have fallen into. Now, I don't do fractional consulting, but we do, full-time executive headhunting as well as fractional placement. When I first started my company, I did whatever I needed to do to earn business. And part of that was negotiating with myself, lowering my price. And to your point, yeah, you start to get referrals, which is great. You do good work, provide value, but then you are trapped at a lower price point. And it's actually quite difficult to break out of that low price point.
Yeah, it is.
In fact, I think I went through, I think it was about a year and a half or so, and I actually had to fire some clients that I hired, that hired me because of my low price point. And it was a painful lesson, but I think it's a fantastic lesson nonetheless. And then negotiating with yourself, that's also something, I've been at this for 7 years, and I see that a lot, where folks discount, and it's easy to talk yourself, the internal monologue, talk yourself down and not even have a conversation with the client first.
Right. And here's my advice on that, Beau, is there's a psychological thing we have, and most of us have it. I always hesitate to make blanket statements of 100%, but a vast majority of us have it. And we want what we can't have. So that's why we look at a Ferrari, or we look at a football team, or we look at a huge house, and we'd like to have it.
Right.
And part of that is just that desire to get that thing that kind of inherently we know is maybe not attainable. So if we take that, we transfer to our pricing, here's what winds up happening is if we give a high price and we discount it right away, as we just discussed, we're discounting our value. But if we keep that,
Right.
and the client goes, well, I'm not sure I was looking on spending that much. That's okay. Maybe we'll be better for a better date. But if you choose to go that route, I'll be here.
Right.
That really kind of sets a trigger with that person that they're not fluctuating, but I really needed this.
Right.
And what winds up happening then is when you hang up the phone, that person continues to sell themselves. Well, I'll figure out a way to pay for this. So I think we need to not only stick to our guns, but we need to have faith in the process.
Right.
That the values and services we're offering, the ICP we've chosen, the elevator pitch we've given is going to continue to work even after we're off the phone. Will it work 100% of the time? Not even close. But the fact is, you continue to sell somebody even after you've stopped doing it verbally.
So that's a really interesting point, and it's leverage, and I agree with you. And so the fractional execs that I typically prefer to work with are the ones that aren't desperate for work. Now, granted, it happens to everybody.
Right. Sure, of course.
That puts them in a position where they can stick with their guns in regards to the pricing. They know the value, and they're not, they don't panic to lower their price. And I totally agree with you that 9 out of 10 times may not be the next minute, may not be the next hour, or it could be a week or 2 weeks later, but they typically come back, especially if they end up going with the low value or low cost player. It doesn't typically work out.
Yeah.
And so it's tough because you're kind of delaying the work, but 9 out of 10 times it actually creates a strong relationship, at least from my vantage.
I agree. And let's not kid ourselves, Beau. We're all raised on the mantra of you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
And
agreed.
whenever somebody is trying to figure out whether they want to pay you for your services, they're in the back of their head determining, am I going to get the value for the money?
Sure.
And Beau, I've argued this over 1 million sales meetings in my life. Price is never the object. Never. If you want something bad enough, you'll find the money for it. So the objective is, how do you make yourself that valuable,
right,
that the money is going to be well spent? So I think really that's what we're talking about here. And in saying this, I realize we haven't gotten into the how do you price yourself yet, but we can still do that if we have time.
Yeah, no, we have time. But again, I think that is super interesting. And then the point that I was thinking, lastly, just to tie this off, is that there's also those that negotiate to negotiate, right? They think everything. And
Right.
those are the people that I avoid like the plague at all possible. And I'm like, the price is the price, so sometimes better just to walk away if need be. But let's get tactical.
I agree. Yeah, sure. Sorry about that.
So now this is a tough question to answer because not all services are created equal. Fractional is a pretty ambiguous term, which encompasses a tremendous amount of different skill sets. So let's just talk about kind of at a high level in regards to pricing. Do you have a best practice? Is it monthly, weekly, retainer based, hourly, project? I've seen everything across the board. I personally have priced it across the board. We've since put a wrapper around the way that we do engagements, but I'd love to hear from your perspective, maybe a few tips and tricks for somebody who's just getting started, or again, who's struggling putting together, a project that actually makes sense for them and their customers.
Yeah. So, Beau, when it comes to setting up the pricing, in my opinion, a lot of people do it the incorrect way. So they basically say, how much would I like to make an hour? And how much would I like to make a month? And so they start their pricing that way. Mm-hmm. I would argue you need to reverse engineer everything. Okay. So what do you want to make this year? What's a reasonable amount? And some people research it on Google. Other people base it on a 10% increase from last year. However you want to determine that number. I'm not here to tell you that. But then you need to divide it out. So you've got 12 months. And to make that number, you need to make X number of dollars monthly. Mm-hmm. And will that X number of dollars meet your bills? And how much do you want to go above that? So, Beau, people need to reverse engineer this and figure out what they need to make. Then they need to add on their expenses, then add on their profit factor or what they want to make above and beyond that.
Mhm.
And that's really where the pricing conversation should start. It should never be looking at a survey online and going, oh my God, the average is $250 an hour, so that's what I'm going to charge. That's putting the cart before the horse. So when we look at it that way, then we need to look at how we do our services. I do have a rate that I prefer to go an hour, but I never sell on an hourly basis. To me, and I realize I'm going to ruffle some feathers with this, but to me, you should never say an hourly amount. You should say an amount that you want to get when it's all said and done.
Mhm.
So what I will do is I will sell out blocks of my services. So if I know something's going to take 18 hours, I'll take my preferred hourly rate, I'll multiply it out times 18 hours, then I'll give them that finalized price.
Mhm.
But I also have retainers. So there's three ways I do mine, Beau. The first is by proposal. Somebody needs an onboarding program. I know how long it's going to take. I know how long it's going to take to develop the collateral and bring in instructional designers to create the slides. Here's my proposal for getting that done. If it's fractional, I go on a monthly basis. It's a monthly basis. You pay me up front, at least half, and then we'll do half at the end of the month. If I know you better, we may negotiate other terms, but I always get half up front. And then the third way is I sell blocks of my time. So when I do neurolinguistic programming coaching, if I'm trying to get somebody past a hump in their life or helping them sell themselves better or get over imposter syndrome, I sell them blocks of my time. So it's usually in blocks of 4 hours. And I do that for this reason. I've had it in the past and I made the huge mistake of just doing it hour by hour. And somebody will stop after an hour. They'll try something very half-heartedly, and then they'll say this doesn't work.
Right.
So I started doing blocks of 4 so that we would get some sort of result from 4 hours together, but I would still have the liberty to do it just an hour a week or 2 hours a week. So those are the 3 different pricing models I have.
Right.
And depends on the service.
Yeah, no, I think it's super interesting. It's funny is I've heard people that literally took, what their, their salary was, in corporate America, divide that by 2,000, and that's their hourly rate.
There you go.
I've also talked to people who've done the research. And it's like, oh, well, 250 is the average for COO. And it's like, well, does that kind of, is that commensurate with your experience level? And a lot of times that's
Right.
right. So it's kind of research,
Sure it is.
geography, service. And I agree with you as well in regards to maybe having different types of pricing for the different services. So if we kind of talk about us as an example, one thing I've found, and it sounds like you've kind of experienced this a little bit with kind of the 1 hour, one-off projects, is that there needs to be a certain level of pain associated with the engagement and the price point for the customer to keep the project top of mind. That also too keeps the fractional exec engaged, right? So find that threshold, and we found that typically it's going to be 5 hours per week plus. Right.
Gotcha.
At some price point. So typically the way we do it, we're almost like a retainer with an hourly component hybrid, right? So we sell in blocks of hours. So it's 5, 10, 15, 20 per month.
Yep.
So that's the baseline. But then if there's overages, then we will bill for those overages. So they've got a baseline of hours that they can kind of expect. There's a baseline of pain from the customer's perspective. But if they hit the busy season, then obviously I keep wanting to say free agent, the fractional exec is going to get paid for the hours that they work to ensure that their payment is kind of ebbs and flows with the business.
Right.
So there are a bunch of different ways out there, but what I have found is that putting some sort of wrapper around the engagement from an hourly perspective is important, but then also too, affixing that with an amount that will be painful enough for the client to stay engaged, but also high enough to keep the fractional themselves engaged, because that's where the magic actually happens, when both people are working together and there's an equitable price component that the two parties kind of collectively figured out.
Yeah, and there's one other piece in there, Beau, that I think bears discussion, is a lot of fractional executives that I talk to, I shouldn't say a lot, but a decent portion of fractional executives I talk to do a set amount of their engagement. So they'll say, I'm going to go in as a COO and it's got to be a 6-month engagement. I honestly go exactly the opposite of that. I
Same.
will tell people I think it's going to take 6 months, but my interest isn't locking you in for a 6 month engagement. So we may finish sooner, we may finish later.
Mhm.
And honestly, Beau, we may find after 3 weeks of working together,
It's not the right
we're
fit.
just not fitting. So I'm a firm believer in once this month is over, we re-sign for another month. And frankly, I haven't ever had a client not do that.
Right.
But I think there's a certain amount of value to say to a client, listen, this is going to continue based on your needs, and I'm not going to lock you in. I
Right.
think that's a valid selling point.
I completely agree. We actually do something similar where we prefer to lock in for a longer engagement, but have a 30-day kick out. So we're not re-signing an SOW or going through a scoping exercise every month. But
Yeah.
I mean, if it's not the right project or if it's not the right person, then
Yeah.
let us know and we'll part as friends. And I think
Yeah.
at this level in particular, soft skills and personality trump, not always, but a lot of time, trump skill set. It's super important that the folks in the room work together and see eye to eye. And it a lot of times it takes 30 days, maybe 60 days to figure out if that's your person. But I would not want to continue a project, into 6 months if I realize on day 31 that, hey, we just can't work together.
Yeah. Or maybe their objectives change or their
Yeah,
culture is bad. To stay in a company that just doesn't have the right culture or objectives is a lose-lose. You're not
for
going to help
sure.
them to the best of your ability, and you're going to hate coming to work every day.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, personal philosophy, not everybody agrees on that, but that's kind of where I stand on it.
I love it. Yeah, no, we see eye to eye like usual. So transitioning a little bit, I think this is a really interesting question as well. Ideal client mix, right? Like fractional to me means that it's somebody who's working a couple different engagements at any given time, whereas interim is going to be more so, hey, I'm locked in for 40 hours a week with one client, right? So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your philosophy and perspective on fractional and what that ideal client mix is, customer mix is, how many, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I get asked this a lot. The reason I do blocks of 4 is that's how much time I'm willing to give at a time to a client. So normally what I will give to a client is 4, 8, 12, 16 hours a week, depending on the intensity. Because you and I both know that different clients require different intensities at different times. In the beginning, it's the formation of something. And then in the middle, there may be a little bit of a drop off while all the ashes fall from the explosion. And then,
Right.
so it can be different. And that's, I'm sure, why you do blocks of 5 as well, is you want to make sure it's done in chunks.
Mhm.
I have one client who takes probably the largest chunk of my time. And then I have several clients that take smaller chunks.
Mhm.
So I don't know if, and again, I'm going to say something controversial here. I don't know if fractional is spending all your time with one client every week,
Right.
or if fractional is better defined as having multiple clients on any given week. And I'm not here to set the law on that. I have no idea what works better. My personal feeling is I like to have up to 4 clients at a time. I can't possibly go over and still give the dedication, because part of the service I offer, Beau, is not only do I dedicate that many hours, but then I make myself available for office hours towards the end of the week, plus emails and texts. And anything over 4 clients is just overwhelming for me. So I don't go beyond that.
It can be too much. Yeah. And I'll go ahead and say something controversial, if you will. I mean, again, to me, I kind of define these as 2 different things. Interim is all involved, 40 hours a week, whereas fractional is going to be, hey, I work 2 to 3 different engagements. And
yeah,
advantage, what I've seen is the most successful fractionals have, 2 to 3 engagements at any one given time, different clients, but also have an equitable distribution of time, but also revenue that's coming from those clients, right? So maybe it's
correct.
33 and a third across their portfolio, right? It's called a portfolio.
Right. Yeah.
And that way, what's really important is that, if you find yourself in a situation with 80% of your time with one client, and that client goes away, you've got a significant shortfall that you've got to fill.
100%.
And that can be really, really daunting for a lot of people and really scary. And newsflash, and I'm going to say this as well on the record, is that your engagement does have an end date. It just hasn't been decided yet. Like at some point, it is going to end. And so
Yeah.
again, if you've got an equal distribution, I'd rather replace, 33% of my income than 80. And so that's what I've seen the best practice. And it could be, you've got 4 engagements, 25 apiece, et cetera. Maybe it's 2, 50-50. But again, mitigating and hedging that risk is really important from my perspective. And the most successful folks that I speak with, that's kind of what they're doing.
Yeah. And maybe just to add this, and this probably goes without saying, but what I do is I make enough on my engagements that I set a bunch aside so that if God forbid I do go through a dry period, it doesn't mean it's a desperation period. It just means that I'm financing myself for that time period. And I don't go through this flurry of new biz dev where I'm just throwing out a million different, marketing automation tools and hoping somebody picks up on it. So I think frugalness is important, right? Or lowering your price.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, cool. So I think a nice segue would be now talking about, we talked about pricing, we've talked about engagements, clients, but like how can somebody actually make the transition from full-time to fractional? What are some best practices there? And obviously there's not a one size fits all.
You're right. Exactly.
I'd love your perspective.
So you can always take the Cortez method, and we all know the story of Cortez and exploring the new world, and he needed to conquer the land and his people were afraid. And so he just burned the ships. He said, you could try to go home, but there's nothing out there to take you home. So we're all committed. So I've seen people do that. The hard part about that, Beau, and I think it goes without saying, is that it can lead to a lot of tension. Yeah. So you're desperate, all of a sudden you're cut off from your income, you don't have anything. I think it tends to promote a lot of doubt, but I also think it promotes creativity. There's nothing that gets the mind going quite like the fact that you've made a total commitment. Right. This is your only way to go. And not only is there nothing in the rear view mirror, but there's no rear view mirror. You're just looking straight ahead through the windshield. Right. Now, this, of course, is based on your tolerance. What kind of personality you have, what's your motivation? So there's that. Another part is when you're in corporate America, start some side gigs, start doing consulting work, get on LinkedIn as much as you can, build your network as much as possible, and start to gradually do a segue out of corporate America. And then I think there's that third population. And if I'm missing one, please let me know. But there's that third population where the corporation said, Jake, you're done. Yeah. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate your 16 years, but now you're out. And I think there's that group as well, where you didn't have a choice in the matter and your ships have been burned for you. And that leads to a whole different mindset. But I would say to people who have low risk, tolerance, start side gigs first and see if you can work your way out to a comfort level. Yeah. So that's super interesting. I did burn the boat. I literally jumped out of corporate America, and I'll never forget it. This is a topic for another day, but it was the most nervous that I've been in my life outside of asking my wife to, if she wanted to get married. But like, I was so nervous, and not because I was nervous about telling my boss, but because it was like, this is happening. Like I'm leaving. Yeah. And now granted, while I burned the boat, I also feel like I got my business to 70 to 80% as far as I could, basically, while working in corporate America. I worked on it for 2 years. So I don't want to say that it was a flippant decision. Like I literally worked on it for 2 years, realized I could never get it to 100%, and I've gotten it as far as I can. So I jumped out, I did burn the boat, but again, I did the due diligence. I think to your point as well, if you can find a way to start a side hustle along the way, and at least have your ICP dialed in, like your deliverable, your service dialed in, your pricing, that all that legwork can be done while employed in corporate America. And for the employers out there, it can also be done at nighttime or on the weekends. But I think that's important. And also too, I've seen a lot of people that are able to turn their previous employers into their first customers by virtue of being very transparent. Excellent point. I think, of course, that can be a slippery slope for some companies. But if you've done your ICP, you're convicted on going fractional, and you're going to leave, there's not much risk to try to flip that, employer into a customer. And I've seen a lot of folks have that success. And lastly, to your point, Jake, about risk aversion, I think that is something that is important
in the fractional space, what's your tolerance for risk? What's your spouse's tolerance for risk?
Right.
So, those that are very risk averse, I do recommend starting the side gig, trying to turn your employer into a customer if at all possible. But also too, making sure you're prepared for this, right? I'm going to give myself 6 months. My expenses are X. I've got Y dedicated to float myself, and I'm going to see if it works. And if it doesn't, I'll go back to corporate America.
Yeah. I agree with you about the spouse too. That's a super important point because many people that are listening to this aren't the only person in their household. And when you're going through that stress, it affects everybody in the house. The financial stress is tough. So excellent point, Beau.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it's tough. You need to make sure all your people are on board, right? Not just, hey,
Yeah.
I left corporate America. I'll figure it out,
Yeah, when the honeymoon period of that wears off, it can get tough.
It can get tough. It does. And there's an ebb and flow. And I've learned a lot of what not to do along the way, which again, maybe we need to have a third follow-up here on the podcast. But lastly, and again, this is a loaded question. I think it's hard to answer because it depends on your space, your expertise, myriad of factors. But how long can somebody expect for it to take to get a client? And we like again, I know it's a loaded question, but what do you think that time frame typically is?
Yeah, it's funny. I was on a podcast the other day and we discussed this question pretty much in detail.
Yep.
And I'm going to tell you the same thing I told them. You're going to hate my answer, but allow me to put it in context once I've given it. It can be an hour to 15 years.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you this just based on experience. I've had a networking call where in less than an hour, they've gotten back to me and we've signed a contract. And then within a couple of months ago, I gained a new client from somebody I worked with 15 years ago.
Right.
So I think there's that range. But if we want to talk about a reasonable amount of time, I think both you're doing everything right. If you're showing persistence, if you're networking, if you're doing the reach outs and dedicating yourself to really talking to just your ideal customer, I would say 6 to 9 months is pretty reasonable. I've seen it go out as far as a year.
Yeah.
But I think 6 to 9 months is a pretty reasonable amount. Again, there's going to be people who do it a lot quicker, and there's going to be people who maybe 2-3 years.
Yeah.
But I think if you're really diligent, you're hammering everything that you should be doing, 6 to 9 months is reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, I typically share a similar time frame. That's like, I'd say 6 months is kind of like the marker, but prepare for 9.
Right. Yeah.
You never know. Obviously, folks that have panache, there's other kind of characteristics and soft skills that may drive somebody to get a client earlier. It could be 3 months. But typically I would prepare for 6 months because it does take reps to get your ICP dialed in. It does take reps to get your pricing dialed in.
Yeah.
Offering dialed in, and whatever you think it's going to be when you jump out, it's going to change. And it may change significantly, or it may change minimally, but it's going to change. And there are going to be some tweaks that you're going to have to make along the way. But this also kind of ties back to risk aversion and the previous question about, were you able to turn your employer into a client? Did you have side hustle? Did you have side gigs?
Yeah.
What kind of infrastructure are you stepping into? Is there 0, or is there, 50% has been built out, 80%, et cetera? But I feel a lot times too, people have kind of happy eyes and happy ears about the space. And it's like, I'm getting a client in 2 weeks. And it's like, well, maybe you can, but how strong is your network? There's a lot that go into this. And lastly, I'll tie this off as a long-winded answer, but I typically do tell people when they first start, like, leverage your network, and you're as strong as your network. Those are the first people that I actually would be reaching out to, is everybody that I know, any center of influence, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be best positioned to help you find your first gig.
Well, and that's a really good point, though. And I think maybe we add on top of that, ask for the business.
That's for this.
I've coached people who are like, I put myself out there for the past 6 months. It's like, did you ever ask for the business? Well, no, I don't want to sell myself. I don't want to, push myself on people. Hey, that's your job now. Yeah. Your job is to go out there, promote yourself, and ask for the business. And we all have the best laid plans, but I think Mike Tyson said it best. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Yeah. And so even the best laid plans are going to run into stuff. Yeah. And, frankly, there's sometimes you run across a client by accident. just you stumble across something and it hits for you
Right.
and you think it's great. But I
Yeah.
guess to tie this up in a bow, I think it's also important that when you've got your first client to don't stop what you're doing. I think we look and go, okay, I broke the seal. Everything's good now.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry ever again. And the fact is now is when you have to kick it into a higher gear.
I agree. A lot of folks too. It's like, I don't have time for business development now. I'm heads down with the client. Again, newsflash, that project is going to end. It just has not been finished, right?
Yeah,
And just to kind of follow
100%.
the point about asking for the business, I'm 7 years into my journey. And one thing I'm just now starting that I wish I started 4 years ago was not asking for business, because I've done that, but asking for the referral. That's particularly challenging for me. But hey, this person's interesting. They hit my ICP. You guys are friends. We're friends. Please make an intro. And I mean, you may be surprised as to how quickly those intros actually happen, but you have to ask for them.
Absolutely agreed. And maybe a good takeaway here, Beau, is some people say I'm not good at selling. And what's funny is if we think about it, we're all really good at selling. I sold my spouse on marrying me. I sold the kids on going to college. I sold my dad on the fact that I'm doing well. We all do it.
Right.
It's just we don't do it for ourselves. And a person that's coming out as a CMO for a company for the past 20 years, their business card sold themselves and everybody knew they were the CMO for the company. They never had to sell. But don't fall into the illusion that you can't sell because you're not a salesperson. We can all sell. It's just having passion about what you do is what's selling you.
That's great. And I will layer on top of that. And just one last point is that it's funny, ironically, a lot of the best salespeople that I talk to are like, I can't do sales. And I'm like,
right.
your copywriting was fantastic. Our discussion was great. You had great energy. Like, you're a really good salesperson. No, I'm not a salesperson. I'm a marketer, or I'm a finance. I'm like, no, you're doing it. You're better than anybody I know. So.
Yeah, if I can build on that just for a second, it's funny. I talked to somebody the other day and I said, storytelling is important when it comes to selling yourself. And they said, I don't have a story to tell. I had a really uneventful childhood, nothing cataclysmic. I grew up in a great home. My parents were good. I said, you just told me a story.
Right. Yeah.
You're a storyteller.
Yeah.
So I think people have inherent abilities that they've taken for granted that when you put a label on it, it's all of a sudden something different. But we're all storytellers and we're all salespeople.
I love it. We'll end there. Hey, Jake, thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Beau.
Always some sage advice. We'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile, email address, and all that. And real quick and short, where can people find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn as Jake Stahl. I know there's a million of us, but only one with this face. And they can also find me at jakestahlconsulting.com.
Excellent, man. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Beau.